I'm Neil Hague. I'm an artist and author, lecturer. Now, some of the things I'm going to talk about take a little bit of stretching the imagination a little bit. I've done a lot of travels and a lot of wandering over the years, and I've spent a lot of time in France, and this is where the Cathar thing will fit in eventually. I've put myself into some very interesting situations, not least my tent there in the middle of the volcano in the Volvic region many years ago. And you know the old saying in the Bible, I think it's in Mark, about nature abhorring a vacuum, you know, and the idea of plonking that in the middle of nowhere. And then in the middle of the night, I was scared out of my wits. I tell you that the thing that appeared in the middle of the night, you know, you don't stick your head out the tent for one of those. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because of my love for France and the travelling I've done in France. You know, it's kind of taken me into these weird worlds of wandering and working things out on that level. And then I found this slide, which I thought was great because it says it all, really. And it's part of what I'm going to get into. What I'm going to do to start with is talk a little bit about Gnosticism, only very briefly, because Gnosticism is where we kind of get the pretext and the context a little bit for Cathar. If we try and understand what the Cathars were about, there is a connection to Gnosticism, as I've found out. So looking at that, I'm quite interested in some of the myths. And some of these myths do tell a story which in some ways they allow you to try and understand the mind of the Cathars. Because as you probably, some of you know a little bit about the Cathars, and some of you might know quite a lot about it. And I may well be covering things that you know. But some of the things that I found interesting in is the spirituality and the understanding of their take on being a Christian, or a true Christian as they called themselves. So the idea of Gnosticism and going back to the oracle at Delphi, and this idea of understanding the treasures of knowing yourself, and this understanding of a pleroma, fullness, that was caught up in the spirit and the divine. I think very much they were interested in this understanding. I don't think they had the language like we could have to describe it today. The idea of living light, of plasma, which makes up 85% plus of the universe. It was a living organism. So the divine, and what the Gnostics talked about in terms of the aeons, the upper and lower aeons, were very much part of this living plasma. And this plasma we see in everything from solar flares to the Ouroboros. You know, it can be typical in terms of electricity. It's the electric universe that some scientists talk about, not least Tesla, when he said if you want to understand the universe, you've got to think about energy and vibrations, and magnetism as well. So the Gnostics were talking about the pleroma and the aeons, which, you know, as you'll see from some of the slides, it goes back quite a few thousand years. And I think the Cathars were of this stream of knowledge. I think this idea of a kingdom of heaven is part of this understanding of the Cathars. Just a quick diagram there, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the idea of the upper aeons and the lower aeons. And it's interesting how the planetary bodies are in the lower aeons, and the upper aeons attach themselves to Sophia. This is the interlude between the upper and lower. What's interesting is when you do a little bit of research into the Cathar and you look at some of the symbolism that was being used, this Cathar watermark, I think, relates very much to the idea of the Taurus constellation and the Orion constellation. And it has something to do with Gnosis as well, because of the serpent. The serpent is spouting these three circles, which relates to the Trinity in some way as well. The horn below the bull there, the horn, could be the horn of plenty. I mean, it's up for interpretation, but this idea of the Cathar watermark being connected in some way to this symbolism that relates to Orion and Horus and a divinity within the heavens, and the interrelationship between the two is something I found very interesting. I'm writing about it at the moment. Just to put it into perspective very quickly, the Milky Way and the Sun and Orion, we're in the Orion spur, so there must have been something huge about this symbolism and the Son of Man symbolism. So much so that when you start researching, you find that some of these ancient crusader castles, which will become relevant, are almost correlations with the Orion constellation. Bellatrix especially is out in the area not far from Byblos, where they've found areas submerged under the sea. Rigel, you know, and Betelgeuse, the land of giants, Baalbek. All these things are interconnected, and Gary A. Davies has done some great work in looking at that. So I'm mentioning that because I think the Son of Man idea that the Cathars were seeing themselves part of this spirit, this knowledge, is something to do with their understanding of the divinity in the heavens, and the Gnostics knew the same. Adam Kadmon and the Fool and the Major Arcana and the 22 bones in the skull and all the rest of the symbolism relates to this, and it relates to Orion. So do the caves of creation as well, because they're part of the Orion Nebula. It's interesting, when you start looking at Christian symbolism, and I found this in America, Jesus depicted in the Orion Nebula, there's something about the Son of Man and the projection from Orion, the idea of the starman that fell to earth. There's something very intriguing about all of this, so much more so that you have this duality blueprint. And as we know, the Gnostics and the Cathars were dualists, and they understood dualism in that way. So let's look at the Gnostic Cathars and the myths behind them a little bit more. The idea, I don't know whether you know about the story of Sophia and the texts that were found at Qumran, especially the Nag Hammadi and the Apocryphon of the Archons. These texts talk about these aeons in such a way that they're almost personified energy. And it's fascinating when you see the story of Sophia in the Gnostic myth being this goddess energy, this Greek word for wisdom, and giving birth to some kind of semi-creator, a lesser creator in the Gnostic mind. This creator was seen as the fake creator. The ones that the Cathars talked about when they were in their prime in France was this dual god, the idea of the divine and the fake creator. The creator of the world, as they understood it, was a world that wasn't coming from the same source as where they said they understood they came from. So the Gnostics very much we're talking about the Sophia, the goddess, an aeon, consciousness, plasma, pleroma, giving birth to a fake deity. And I think a lot of that is caught up in the dualist myths as well. Humans are caught up in the middle between this battle between almost, let's call it good and evil if you like. And that's the idea of the duality of the Cathars. There's this understanding of this battle between good and evil. And the fact that when you look at their life, as I'll come to, they almost abstain from not pretty much everything, but they abstain from a lot of things that the church at the time were not abstaining from, as I'll come to, you'll see. Some of the things they were doing. If you go to Toulouse, which a lot of the history takes place in and around Toulouse, and you go to the palace, the Salle d'Istre, in the Palace of Toulouse, you'll see this painting here of the lion with a spear through it, and this was the fall of Simon de Montfort, who was one of the chief, I would say, forces that were put against the Gnostic Cathars at that time. If you go into the understanding of the origins of Catharism, you have to go back to Manichaeism. Have you heard of Manichaeism before? You must have done if you've looked at it. And the Manichaeism is interesting because it feels like it was a religion that never really came to be, almost as though it should have been as equal as all of the other faiths. It should have been a faith that was dominant, like Hinduism, like all the rest of them. And for some strange reason, it didn't. It was taken and it was subdued, almost in the same manner that Catharism was. It's not the first time it's happened in history as well. If you look back throughout history, you'll find this subduing and this almost horrific removal of different people of different faiths. So they talked to a dualistic cosmology, just like the Cathars. And I think this is probably one of the roots of Catharism. What's interesting is some of the books, like the Book of Giants and the Psalms, came from some of Mani's writings back in that period. And then we look at the symbolism of the Cathars. We have the Coptic cross, which in many ways is the wand of Egypt. It's the Ankh, as far as I can see. And what I found very interesting when I've looked at this closely is that there is some kind of etymology here which relates to runic symbolism and the Celtic symbolism, and not least when we look at the idea that the Cathars received the highly symbolic language of the Occitanie language, which relates to this symbolism. I wonder how similar they are, the glyphs of Jesus and the glyphs of the Ock, and the fact that they saw themselves as emissaries for Christ, these people. As true Christians, they saw themselves as not miniature versions, but they were channeling the Spirit of Christ. That's why they were so powerful in what they were doing. There's not a lot of history and a lot of text on that. There's only what the inquisitors recorded, but that's what it looks like. There was many other cultures affected by Gnosticism. I think a strand of Catharism comes from the cult of Mithra, and you'll probably see why. If you've ever been to Montségur in the region, you'll see some interesting symbolism around some of the areas there, which looks like quite possibly way before the Visigoths were in the Occitanie, there was various cults that related to the Gnostics and to Mithra. Then we have the Armenians, which was a prominent culture way back, going back to the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Chumash cultures, interestingly, I wondered about the flag of their shamanic cultures with the aeons depicted in their flag there at the top with the tree and the 3 stars. So all of this art is intriguing because it's very, very much in keeping with the styles eventually that you'd find in the south of France. And obviously, a lot of that stuff I've just shown you relates to the Bogomils, which were in an area now we know as Bulgaria, and obviously the capital of Bulgaria is Sofia, isn't it? So obviously they were influenced by Gnosticism. So we have this migration from the Palatians out of Iraq with Manichaeism, coming out through the Palatians into Bulgaria, the Bogomils, and eventually making our way into Europe. The Waldensians and then the Cathars. Some of the Cathars obviously were in the north, and I mean, Patrick was telling me earlier about a place, where was it again, up in where you went this summer? There was Ashridge House in the Chilterns. I mean, they must have got into Europe and into England at some point. There must have been splinters of them around, because they were Christians on the move with a mission, as far as I can see. So when you look at that and you look at the movement of the Gnostics and you see where they went and where they ended up, was in a place called the Occitanie. I mean, it wasn't France. You probably know this. It wasn't never called France. This was a separate country. It was a country that had lots of wealth and treasures, and very much connected to the royal house of England through Henry I, Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, all of these connections through bloodlines and marriages. So you had the gentry of this area. I mentioned the Waldensians because they were Cathar in belief, but you had the gentry of this area, which were very much almost in love with the Cathar and the Cathar preaching. So, to set the scene a little bit, if you go back to this point in 1167, you know the third councils of the Laterans that the Roman Catholics were having. Well, what I found interesting was that in the middle of the, I think it was just before the third, between the second and the third, there was a Cathar gathering in St. Felix on Largo, which is just outside Toulouse. It's just outside Toulouse, not far, slightly to the west. And there were several bishops that gathered, but what was unusual about this is these were not Roman Catholic bishops. They were Cathar Gnostic bishops that were gathering. And I think in some ways, and this is just my understanding of it, I think when the Third Lateran Council met 10 years later roughly, I think that's when it started to become an issue for the Roman Catholic Church, that they were gathering in such a way that it was going to be a power in its own self, a church in its own right in the Occitanie. I can't remember which one, maybe Patrick could correct me, but one of these Lateran councils, I think it was this one, where the Catholic Church decided that sodomy was going to be, a sin. Did you forget all about that one? That just gets thrown out the window at some point. It's fascinating once you start reading, and I've been reading a lot. I can recommend 3 really good books. You probably know of Arthur Gurdam's work, but if you want a real history of some of the things I'm going to talk about, Stephen O'Shea's book is wonderful in terms of its history. It's not a spiritual book, it's a book with more facts and dates and so on, whereas these are a little bit more spiritual. The reincarnation thing is something I'll come to. It's intriguing. I don't think the Cathars were that big on reincarnation. It wasn't something that they were that interested in from what I've seen. However, there has been many writers talk about them being Buddhists, the Buddhists of Southern Europe, which you can understand that to a certain extent because of what they were doing. Oh, and then there's Pelisson's work, which is basically the only real writings on the Cathars, and I've seen historians debate this. I was watching a video the other night at the Polyglot lectures in Cambridge, and there's nothing in Occitanie written. So there was nothing really written down about them, hardly, nothing. But there's a lot of documentation thanks to the Inquisition. So either they made it up, which I don't think they did. If you go to the place, you'll see they don't make this stuff up. I think that the horrors that happened in this part of the world were very real and very terrible. And I've been there, like I said, I've been there many times, and you can feel something in the land. When you drive down, actually, when you drive down the A61, just as you pass Montpellier, these are the, you know, you get these landmarks on motorways. These are the things that you see as you head down, and they're called the Cathar Chevalier, the three knights. And there's a bit of symbolism in the threes, the Trinity, the Orion Belt, and all that kind of thing. But it's almost a kind of, I think Francis Cabrel wrote a song about it as well, about the Cathar Chevalier, a beautiful song from the 70s. But there's something quite domineering about them. You know, the way they look like bullets, the machines of war. And you have to face the fact when you go here that this place saw a lot of war and terror. It's a beautiful part of the world, but there is something still in the land. The horrors that happened in that part of the world are fighting against the beauty in the land, which is still there as well, which is connected to that spirituality and the stuff I was talking about at the beginning. So who were the Gnostic Cathars? Who were they? What were they really about? I have my own deep personal views, and like I said, this is very subjective. I mean, some of it can be objective, but it's quite subjective, because there is nothing written. It's all about tracing history back through other belief systems, not least the Gnostics. What I found fascinating is that the Cathar Parfait, or the so-called Bonhomme Bonfemme, carried the Gospel of St. John a lot with them, apparently, in their debates. They were looking at this closely. They saw themselves as continuing the teachings, passing on the light, the Christ light, as they called it. They didn't use that word so much in the Occitane. The only word I remember from the Occitane is parache, which means the great sharing, which is almost like the potlatch of the American Indians. So there's something about the sharing and the giving and the way in which they lived their lives, which was very much in keeping with trying to live like the original disciples around Christ in that sense. They were very much armoured by this spirit, this spirituality. And this bit too, we haven't got much time to read lots of stuff, but this bit of text from the Middle Ages is fascinating. We are the poor Christ who have no fixed abode, the homeless, and flee from city to city like sheep amidst wolves, and persecuted as were the apostles and the martyrs. Despite the fact that we lead a most strict and holy life, preserving day and night in fasts, abstinence in prayers, and in labour from which we seek the necessities of life. What I found interesting is that they say that we are the fathers of opposite descent. We've continued in the grace of God. They like I said, they saw themselves as serving a purpose in keeping the true mission of Christ alive. They had no love for the church at all, the Catholic Church, which was growing at the time, becoming very powerful. If anything, their beliefs were aligned with Greece, with the philosophies of Greece and Alexandria. If they had a connection to the idea of studying and gaining more knowledge and wisdom, they were artists, they were weavers, they were craftspeople. They made only little money from the arts that they made and the bit of farming that they did. They were interested in the Gospel of St. John, like I say, which is born of flesh is flesh. They were interested in the Spirit. And that's why I think when you look at the documentation that the Inquisitors wrote about them, the Inquisitors talked about them being interested in worshipping Christ as a phantom. They had no understanding of their belief. Obviously, they were being singled out for not following the doctrine of the church, but they were following what they believed to be the true teachings. To be distracted by worldly affairs and focus on the divine instead was their key. They were interested not in the material world, even if it was beautiful and it was full of all of this nature and growth and all the things that we know in the seasons. They were interested in the spirit behind it. So they weren't interested in money. They were not interested in riches and wealth. They were only interested in the kingdom of God, from what I've been understanding from my reading of them, which is, again, is a powerful thing. If you think about their desire to bring this knowledge and teachings to this part of Europe, you can understand on one level why the forces were pitched against them to destroy them, to take them away completely, remove them, to the point where, as you'll see, some of the devastation was appalling. I mean, the whole of Béziers was ransacked and everybody was killed. The whole of the town was murdered by the forces that were sent against them, for other reasons as well. So they saw themselves as sons of the living Father, which was quite a heretical thing to say. If you can imagine where the Catholic Church was at this time, you know, to say these things and to be open in public. Can you imagine these kind of debates that we're doing this now tonight? Can you imagine Dominic setting up his stall as such in the medieval village of Toulouse? And then along comes somebody like Bernard Marte, one of the Parfaits, and starts debating with him in open public, and the audience are listening to two sides of a different story. And you can see why, even though the emissaries were sent from Rome to try and persuade them to come back into the flock, the people of Occitanie, they weren't having much luck apparently, because the Cathar priests were holding more sway over these people, including the gentry, like I say, including the people that owned the land in that area. So, I see it as this quite simply, as an image: spirit and light and flame and embers. I should say embers, it's cropped off. They saw themselves as the true emissaries. If this was Christ in the centre, they saw themselves as the light and the flames and the embers coming from this source. And if they saw themselves as that, and as thought and reality, a part of manifestation of reality, they were living this. They were living it in their own way, and it was powerful. We and our fathers of apostolistic descent have continued in the grace of God and shall remain so until the end of time. By their fruits you shall know them. So in other words, it was practice what you preach and follow the scriptures in such a way, and live like the original Christians in the early days, in the days of the Gnostics. And that's what they were doing. That's exactly what they were doing. And they were gathering, like I say, this interest around. I think it was gradually building from around the early 12th century. By the time of the council meeting at St. Felix, and by the time we'd got to the end of the 12th century, there was a real following in that area. And what were they up against? What did they say was the problem with the world? This world is terrible. If you go to Rennes-le-Château, if you've probably been there, which is in the same region, in the same area, you'll see when Saunier built the church, I think when he put Rex, I always think Rex Mundi sounds like a Coronation Street character, doesn't it? The king of the world, the opposite king to God, was the creator of the world that the Cathars said that they were caught up in. And there was nothing in this world that would sway them from their belief in the Almighty and the divine in that way. I think that's probably why they fed no fear of death in the end. When I see images like that, and I don't mean to offend people, but we know the history of what's been going on with the Catholic Church. It's funnily enough, the Catholic Church called Montségur, well, it actually wasn't the Catholic Church, to be fair. It was Blanche de Castile, which was in league with Pope Honorius at the time, called the Montségur the synagogue of Satan. The use of the word synagogue is interesting because there is a Judaic connection in some ways, and the Jews were they were also being expelled from the Occitanie at the same time. These were the Sephardic Jews of Spain that were also getting the same treatment. But there's a bigger picture behind that, and I haven't got time to talk about it tonight because it's quite deep. There's something to do with the Judaic law and Babylon, which connects to this as well. So who were the crusaders? The ones that went against the Cathars at that time? Well, we have Simon de Montfort, the 5th Earl of Leicester, a long line of de Montforts, where the university is named after the family, connected to the royal bloodlines, famous from the Battle of Evesham that took place around 70 years later. A bit of a Cromwell figure, but much worse, especially when they went and marched into the Occitanie. Obviously, you had the King of France as well. And you had Pope Innocent III. These were the three forces. It was a bit of if you don't know anything about the history, the whole reason for the crusade, or the tipping point which created the crusade, was the assassination of one of the Pope's legates, Peter of Castelnau, in 1208 in Toulouse, on the land of Raymond of Toulouse, the 6th Count of Toulouse. They blamed Raymond for the assassination of one of the Pope's men. Hence then, they had what they needed as an excuse to invade. Now, there were several reasons, really. Obviously, one reason was to remove the Cathars, but the other reason was a land grab. They were taking the land. In fact, they were going to take the country. The country wasn't France, and France wanted that country to themselves. This chap, who was a nice guy, I'm joking. A horrible man. I mean, they destroyed 400 villages in 15 years. Béziers was only the first. There was something like 5,000 people murdered. They don't know the exact number because there was no records, but they're guessing from the amount of properties and houses in the region, around 5,000 people. A lot of them were Catholics because, as you probably know the saying, I think it was the Bishop of Narbonne, Armory, who said, when the Crusaders asked, who shall we kill? He said, kill them all. God will know, which ones he wants. These people were disgusting and terrible. And like I say, it went on and it went on for, the first crusade went on for at least 18 years. 20 years it went on in terms of intensity. If you ever go to Carcassonne and you go to the church of Saint Nazaire, the basilisk, it's interesting. It says this on, it's the Roman Catholic cult. I mean, it is a cult. I mean, and there are cults in this world. And Catharism could have been seen as a cult as well. But it's interesting how they marked their ground. They said, no, this was right in the heart of the Occitanie, right in the middle of Carcassonne, which was the centre, the epicenter of this group of people, in the land of the Trencavels. I'll show you a slide in a minute, you'll see what I mean. But they put the bones of Simon de Montfort are here. You can go to the tomb if you fancy it. The church's obsession, especially the Orthodox obsession for blessing war, this machines of war, which is no different to what happened to these people in the Cathar country. They were blessed to go down there and destroy the Cathars. And when you read texts like this, blessed are the peacemakers from the Beatitudes, this is what they said about the Cathars under the Inquisition. Civil authority had no claim on a Cathar since this was the rule of the physical world. According to the Cathars, well, they refused to take oaths in allegiance or volunteer for military service, and this is crucial, they refused to pay taxes to the church in Rome. Now, they had such a sway on the people that had money in the Occitanie because they'd convinced them of this spiritual world and the material world being an illusion and not the world of Christ in that sense. They had managed to get the gentry in trouble with the church as well. But obviously there was other reasons, because they wanted to crush their spirituality, and so they did. As I say, they massacred in Béziers. Some say 20,000. I don't think it was that high. And that was the saying I said to you a minute ago about kill them all, the Lord knoweth them that there is. And it went on, the genocide against them. They were being burnt alive. I mean, the punishment under the Inquisition was burning at the stake. Anyway, there's many other horrible punishments, but that was the main thing. And what's fascinating about the Cathars is that they were burnt en masse according to the records. So Las Tours is a fascinating place. It's one of the Cathar fortresses, which was above above Carcassonne, slightly to the northwest. And this was a place that was hard to take because of its stronghold position. But when they took it in December, and they burnt 140 Cathars at the stake. Some say there's tunnels under here. I've been around here. I mean, I wouldn't know, but there could be tunnels where people were escaping and moving around. They burnt 180 at Minerve. And Minerve's a beautiful place if you ever get a chance to go. This is Minerve here. Mamande, 5,000 later in 1219, under the guidance of Simon de Montfort's son, Armory, who took over, who wasn't as nasty as his father, but still did as much damage. Lavaux, 400. Mosiac, 210. It just went on and on. They just rounded these people up and burned them. And the Inquisition was good at it. The Inquisition became a fascinating machine in itself. And there's been nothing like it in history. The nearest you'll get to the Inquisition would be the Gestapo and the SS in Nazi Germany. I mean, this was a terror that went on for 600 years. It went on through 2 crusades, 4 popes, and there was 3 monarchs pitched against these people. This is the timeline. I haven't got time to go into it. But 316 years of persecution of these people in the Occitanie until they were completely eradicated and removed. It was mass genocide. A genocide that's not talked about, but it was a genocide, quite the same. The chap in the movie, I haven't got time to talk about it. You know, the Inquisitor in the movie, In the Name of the Rose, was the inspiration for some of the later stories around the Cathars as well. What a lot of this did at the time in Toulouse, around this same period, around 1210, 1214 and onwards, became the militia knights, which grew and grew under the guidance of, I mean, some of it, the White Brotherhood was under the Fulk of Toulouse, the horror that he was, the Bishop of Toulouse. So you had the Black Brotherhood against the White Brotherhood. These were mercenaries. These were people that were militias attacking each other, defending the Cathars, raiding Catholics. You know, there was this horror polarization going on all the time. And it happened in this region around Toulouse. So did something that was quite prominent here in 1242, the massacre of Avignon, which was the killing of the inquisitors sent by the Pope. 2 famous inquisitors were killed there. And these were rebel knights. So what they called in French the fédit, the knights without land. They owned nothing. They'd lost their land to the crusade originally years before, and they were just travelling mercenary knights that would work at the bidding of whoever would employ them. Mainly the main employer or the main connection to them was the House of Foix, the Bernard and Raymond Roger of Foix. I'll come to them in a second. And these were the defenders. So this was the House of Foix. Just slightly north of Montségur, these were the main barons and the rulers of that area. Raymond VI of Toulouse, followed by Raymond VII. Raymond Roger of Foix was quite a character from what I've read. I mean, he took no prisoners, and he hated the Crusaders for what they were doing to his lands and to the people of his lands. His sister, they say his sister Escalamon was a Parfait. There isn't much evidence for it, but it's an interesting notion. Raymond Roger was played by this actor in The Labyrinth. You remember The Labyrinth, the 80s movie? And he played the knight in that film, which is based on the Cathars, just so you know that. So Escalamon de Foix was this kind of female goddess-like Parfait, the priestess of Foix, who was a Cathar, but a Parfait. Her brother was Roger Raymond, and when he went to the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, I think it was that one of these where he boasted to the Pope that he'd not killed enough of them. This was a real heated council meeting between all of these gentry from these different places. So the Foix house of the Counts of Foix were total Cathars. Everything about them were Cathar. They say that Escalamon led a load of Cathars towards the end, after the ransacking of Montségur, into the Lombriv caves and the Masdazil caves of the region. And there's a connection to the goddess in this, I think, in some ways. And the Cathars, from the latter days, before they were completely got rid of, were living in caves, I think, out of the way. They were living in caves in Montségur as well. At the top, there was lots of caves. If you've been to Montségur, I've been there quite a few times. It's a special place, as you'll see in a second from some of the slides. I think, like I say, the goddess connection comes from Greece, Cormobenis, and the Hellenistic period of Greece. I think this reverence for the goddess was quite important in that region. I think some of that's been interpreted as the Magdalena connection. I don't know about that. My mind is open to it, but it's definitely come from this love of the land. Even though they weren't interested in the illusionary material world, there was still this love of the land and the goddess. Sophia. And it's interesting because the Dove of Heaven, which was inspired, this piece is not ancient. It was made in 1962 by this artist, Severac. There's many people talked about the Dove of Heaven being connected to the Pleiades. Again, this feminine thing. I'm not sure myself. It's quite interesting. Going back to the Orion stuff I mentioned earlier, I think the Dove of Heaven relates to the Orion Nebula, because when you look at it closely, this is one of the oldest artifacts found at Montségur, the dove. And you see the dove as the Holy Spirit, and those that know their symbolism will know that the trapezium inside the Orion Nebula in some ways looks like some kind of winged spirited creature, and I'm wondering whether that was the connection, the divinity that they were interested in some ways. Maybe they knew about this. I mean, Michelangelo certainly knew about the Orion Nebula from what I've been looking at, and so did all of the other astronomers and scientists that came just not that many years after Michelangelo. There's a really lovely book called Orion in the Vatican by Danny Wilton. It's an e-book, and he's a researcher in America, and it's a fascinating subject. So you had the goddess of Saint Emine and Margaret of Montecada, and all of these symbolism. Lady Carcass. You know the story of Lady Carcass, where at the time of Charlemagne, the village was surrounded, and they looked like they were going to be finished, and so they threw a fat pig over, didn't they, in a catapult. It's the biggest pig they could find, and they said that this prevented. Charlemagne gave up in the end because he thought that they had plenty of food if they were wasting a pig that size. It was that kind of thing. So, but that's where that symbolism of the goddess of Carcassonne comes from. That story. I think Beatrice in Dante's Inferno is also the story of the Cathar. I mean, if you look at it closely enough, I think Beatrice is the Cathar church, the lost faith, guiding Dante and Virgil through the different levels of heaven and hell. What's the name? Purgatory. I'm looking for. That's it. Through purgatory. And then we have the troubadours, which is crucially important because that was reverence for the goddess, the lady. The fin d'amour of the troubadour. The troubadours came before the Cathars. I think the Cathars were here, but I think the troubadours were already there. I think this idea of the troubadours and the spirit of the Occitanie, because like I say, based on their interest in the goddess, but also in poetry, the arts, there would have probably been no Renaissance or no poetry if it wasn't for the troubadours. I mean, some of the poems and the songs that they sang, which were some of them, the Cervantes, were about almost slandering the church, Roman Catholicism, in a very poetic way, but they were really interested in this higher love, a finer love, and something that the Cathars were teaching about, but not in the same way that the troubadours were interpreting through their music. So some of the famous parfaits, and there's many more besides. I think I mentioned Bertrand Marseille, who was the parfait at Montségur when it fell before 1245. This chap here, Gilbert of Cathar, he was the one who debated with Saint Dominic apparently in the early days. He died in 1240. Peter Autier was a lawyer. So the Cathars came from all different backgrounds. He was a lawyer that was basically, he left the area on the first purge, ended up in Lombardy, in the Italian area, and then came back at that time and started preaching again. They were after him big time because he dared to come back and start to preach again in the area about the same stuff that his ancestors had been preaching about. There was others as well, but the most famous one is William Belibaste, the last one that they burnt in 1321. He was a shepherd, not a lawyer. And he was deceived. He was deceived in Spain. The whole Spanish side of it is another story because a lot of them ended up in Catalonia. And the Catalonian language is very similar to the old Occitane language. In fact, the language of Lombardy and the Italian language with the Catalonian is very much connected to the language of the Oc. And that's one of my paintings on the parfait. I show this one because this was the time when the parfait could only travel. They had to travel in pairs as man and wife, even though they weren't, because of the Catholic Church. If they saw two men together, looking quite gaunt, dressed in black with hoods, or in brown or whatever, looking like vegetarians, no meat on them, they knew they were Cathar priests of some shape or form. So it was easier to travel in pairs and pretend. There's a long story of one Cathar priest who pretended he was married for years, and the woman was actually with his friend kind of thing. So they weren't celibate. Well, some of them were celibate as such, but and some of the credentes or the followers, they weren't. They were all happily married and living lives as everybody would live a life. But the ones that saw themselves of that descent from Christ, they weren't. They were living a life of celibacy and eating no meat. Some ate fish, apparently. They were pescatarians, is it? They were fish eaters. In some ways. Then you had the consolamentum and the greeting that came with it. The greeting was for the credentes, but the consolamentum, I think, was almost a kind of form of hands-on healing, as well as a ritual, as well as the last rites. It was used in different ways. I think when the Catholic Church knew about this, I think it triggered their own creation of, and you might correct me on this, on the, what's it called, the transubstantiation, the Eucharist, that came after this. Yeah. That was before it. And I think that was the Catholic Church response to this. That was something that they quickly, when you're trying to sell your own religion and get it packaged right, and then, well, they knew what the Cathars were doing. And this was, the New Age today, this kind of gathering in circles and hands-on healing, they were doing it then. That's what this was. And they were passing on this spirit. The permanent revelation of the Holy Spirit. Carrying the light in a dark world. And if you go there, you'll see that, and I've camped at Bucharest. There's a story I'll tell you at the end. I've camped at Bucharest. It's a fascinating place. You know the book by, you know the John Michel, I'm not an expert on this, but you know the ley lines in the Cathar world. This is just a sample of it, Rennes-le-Château. I've walked these places. I mean, I camped wild at one point. I walked from here, Bucharest, to here, Saint-Just-de-la-Bec. And I didn't know the connection at the time. I camped here and I camped here. These places are all on a ley line grid structure, which, when you look at I forget the name of the author who wrote Genesis, the first revelation, the nice, thick, hardback book, Wood, that's it. Wood talks about this being only something you could do from the air. So, I mean, I don't know. How could you align these places unless you had some kind of aerial system? It's food for thought, isn't it? The original Occitanie cross, you know, is the pre-runner for the European Union, really. I mean, the 12 disciples, the 12 hours, you know, and the 12 tribes and all the rest of it. You can look into that yourself. But that was the original cross, the Occitanie cross, which I think, looking at it as a visual person and a symbolist, I think it relates to the flower of life and the Metatron cube, which is all about this stuff I was talking about at the beginning, the seed of life, the light, the spirit, which travels through everything. I think there was a connection to that. The Manichaean cross is very similar to it as well. And then recently, this was a recent story, I don't know whether you saw this, a quantum physicist trying to split photons and photograph them as they split a single particle. And it's looking like the pate, isn't it? You know, it's looking like the cross. And this is photonic light. The light that the Cathars were talking about. You see the octo light in I'm not an expert on the tarot, but I'm just picking things out. I've read so many different books, but it's interesting how Sophia and the demiurge here with the octo, the symbol of language of light, and the double succotash, this symbol, is interesting as well. I'll come to this. The 8, this is Montségur. This is just opposite Montségur at a place called Monacy. There's what almost looks like a pagan stela. It's as old as the Pog itself. But why the number 8? Is it number 8? It's the symbol of infinity, isn't it? It's the Ock again. Montségur is the most powerful place, one of the most powerful places I've ever been to. Has anybody ever been? Few of you. I mean, did you feel the same? Or you must have felt things there. I know people who've been there, they felt... It gives you the creeps, yeah. There is that side to it, and there's a reason why the creepiness is there. I felt utter sadness when I was there. I mean, I was meditating for hours. I've been there 3 times, and the first time I had this amazing image of, I felt like I was traveling out of my body, going out in different directions, and for some reason I kept getting Tibet in my head. I've never been to Tibet, but I kept seeing Tibet. And I think it must be something to do with the height and the actual ancientness of the place. This is a major ley line. It's a major site. I mean, it took them quite a long time to get to this and to kick them out. And there was a truce of 2 weeks. If you walk up that, you're knackered. You're not going to fight anybody when you get to the top of that. You're not going to swing any swords around at all. How they got up there was amazing. They used a catapult, the catapult system, and they employed Basques, fighters from northern Spain who were expert rock climbers to do it. It's the only way they could get up there. And when they got up there and they got them and they took them down and burnt them, they were happy to go. This is another thing about the Cathars. They seem to be okay with being murdered, being burnt alive. Now, this is what it says in the Inquisitor's documents. You don't know whether it's true or not, but it's interesting how they had no fear of death. It wasn't like as though they were... they had any choice anyway, I know that, but there was this, they did, they could have repented and become a Catholic, that was their choice, but they chose not to. They chose not to give up what they'd been taught. The succotash is interesting, the Gnostics, I'm going back to the Gnostics now, and the symbolism of the 16 and the double 8. I think there's something to do with this and the double infinity symbol, which is, you find it in Buddhism as well, something to do with the light of the eye. That looks so much like a human eye, doesn't it? The symbolism. Like I said, there's me there in Montségur looking quite red. I've been sunburnt, I think, there. It's always misty. You hardly get a clear day when you're up there. And that's a drone view of it. I mean, it's something out of a fairy tale, isn't it? When you think about it, the castle on the hill, and there's so many of these. I mean, the fortress apparently was built around 20 years, built up again, 20 years before they took it, because the Cathars knew they'd come for them, and this was one of the last strongholds. So the ones that had been removed from those other regions I was talking about earlier ended up here. Okay, so, and that was my walk, by the way. That's where I started walking from, just near Keribus, which I'll come to in a minute, and ended up in Four. Now, I've got an admission. I did catch a bus at one point. It's a long walk. It was 90 kilometers, something like 2 weeks. Yeah, it was exhausting, but it was the most amazing connection to the land. Changed my life forever, really. This is me sitting in Keribus. Keribus was the last Cathar stronghold, not Montségur. This fell in 1255. This was the last of them. This was a real bastion. When I meditated here, I had the same connections with other distant lands, and the place I kept getting in my head all the time, I kept seeing Jerusalem, kept seeing Masada, kept seeing Qumran, all these places. Masada was the same, built on a high location, protecting themselves from the invaders, who were the Romans again. You'll see a connect. That's Masada. So I'm not going to go into Masada because it's not part of the talk, but you get the idea of the Cathars being elevated. The castles were Visigoth castles, but they were elevated. The story of me being in that region and having some kind of sleep state, dreaming state, where I dreamt, near Keribus, I dreamt, that's Keribus, by the way, there, in the distance. This is Perpetuus, I'm photographing it from. I'll come to Perpetuus in a minute. The dream I had was very bizarre, but I dreamt that I went underground in the dream. I was underground, as in the underworld, and I was in a cave, and the cave, there was people sheltering, and they were terrified. They were absolutely terrified, but they didn't look human. They were human looking, but they didn't have this ethereal light about them. They looked like the blonde, the golden-haired cherubim kind of image, the kind of, blonde and blue-eyed. And as I approached them, this little boy came out of the group, and he was only, so high, and he said to me, "You've got to help us. You've got to help us. It's your time now." And I didn't understand any of this stuff. It didn't make any sense to me. What really amazed me, don't you have these in your dreams where you can see your own body? Have you ever experienced that, where you can look at yourself? And I looked at myself in my dream, and I had chainmail on. I had some knight's armor of some kind. But what freaked me out the most was when I lifted my hand up to console this boy, I had a paw. I didn't have a human hand at all. I had a paw. Anyway, that dream stuck with me all my life since I had it 25 years ago. And there's been things that have happened to me, and lion symbolism. I won't go into it now. But it was only recently when I was looking at the new Star Wars stuff, and then I went back and looked at some of the older stuff, and I couldn't believe it. The lions in the Star Wars epic that Lucas went on to do the offspins, he created a race of lions called Cathar. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? I mean, I had the dream 25 years ago. This was in more recent times. I'll leave that one with you. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is there's a lot of ancient lion people in art going back 30,000 years, and there's lots of lion symbolism we could talk about another time. Anyway, look, these castles, from Perpetuus to Keribus, they could speak to each other. Like in Lord of the Rings with the torches, lighting the torches between castles. They could do all of that. This is Perpetuus. I camped here. Shouldn't have done. It's against the rules, but I'm a bit of a rule breaker. So we camped. We put our tent in there for the night when everybody had gone. That was the most amazing and disturbing night I've ever had in terms of spirit activity. I'll show you the location. It was wrong way again. It was there. I'm pointing at it. That's where the tent was. I took that a few years ago. I went back just to point at the tent. And the tent... Who's the other person pointing? Who's the other... do you know what? I have no idea what she's pointing at. I think she was just copying me. Anyway, so the tent goes up at 8 o'clock on a summer's evening. By the time we've got into the midnight hours, and I'm trying to fall asleep, and I've got my French partner with me at the time, I couldn't sleep, she couldn't sleep. Oh my God, it was horrendous. The wind was one thing, but it wasn't the wind. I could hear bloody horses all the time. I could hear horses, and I could hear chewing grass or hay. I'd had enough of it. After about half an hour of this, and it went on for an hour, I unzipped the tent, I got the torch, there's nothing there. I mean, people do ride horses, there was nobody up there at 2 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, it wasn't that many days later when we were carrying on hiking, I ended up in another town somewhere, and I found this old map of Perpetuus, and where we'd put the tent was where they kept the horses in the Cathar period. It's funny, isn't it, what spirit can do when it plays with your mind in that way. So yeah, Perpetuus, fascinating place. That was given freely to the Crusaders. They didn't fight for that. There was a deal done there, and so they didn't ransack that one so much. It was left in its state. But the apprehension and the fear, if you notice the lands and the forests around it, you can imagine the crusading armies coming in and following the chain of the valleys, and these people waiting in these places for their worst possible nightmare if it came. So I'm not good with this. Oh, there we go. Gorge de Galamus. That's another place I passed on my travels. The Cathars were living like hermits at this point here, stuck in this really prehistoric rock with the most beautiful river running below it, which leads you on to Bugaresh and then leads you on to the Rennes-le-Château area if you keep walking that way. Fascinating place. And then we have, after that, we have one of the most amazing castles in the area, was Puivet. Chateau de Puivet. You might recognise it from the movies. It was in a Johnny Depp film called The Ninth Gate. Kind of an occult film, isn't it? You know, the one with and some of the filming took place in that. This place is a beautiful place. In fact, I walked, there might be another shot. There's a dog there for a reason, I'll tell you why in a second. It's not just me slipping a slide in, losing myself. I walked the forest to this place. I had the most amazing walk to this place. It was like almost a kind of pilgrimages weren't always spiritual. There were forms of punishment in pilgrimage, but it felt for me like a spiritual thing to get there. The spirit of the land and the spirit of Puivet is all about the troubadour. The dog is there for a reason, because while I was in Puivet and I was camping there, I befriended a dog, a stray dog. And you know what? I've never had this experience ever in my life ever again. And I'll never forget this dog. This dog was like meeting an old friend, and he knew me. And I wanted to take him with us. We couldn't. I was going back to England. I couldn't take a dog, back to England. Even in the 90s, it would have been complicated, wouldn't it? But this dog seemed to recognise me. And he wanted to sit with me. I kept walking and sit. And in the end, we had to say goodbye. I felt like I was saying goodbye to a friend, an old friend. Now, the Cathar, some of the Cathar stories, whether they're true or not, do talk. There are some scriptural bits and bobs in the Inquisitors' text talking about them saying that sometimes the spirit of a man or woman would enter the spirit of an animal. And they would see their friend. There's one story of a Cathar meeting a horse, meeting his old friend, and it just made me, I didn't know any of this stuff when I was there, but I think there's something to do with that. I'm not an expert. I'm not so big on reincarnation. I don't fully understand the idea of it. I think it's more of a, I remember what I mean is I understand that, but I don't understand the karmic side of it very much. I think it's almost like a ball and chain. Whereas
these hounds that befriend people are associated with the shaman.
The shaman, I didn't know that. So, and see, for me there's Orion symbolism again, because you've always got Orion with Sirius, the dog, and that runs right throughout all this symbolism. You'll see it in fox hunting, which I absolutely abhor. I've talked about that before, but there's all of this same symbolism. Go away, dog, now, I've seen you enough. Okay, so I walked from, can you see the Pic de Bugaresh here? I walked through all of this, through Nebai, all the way through these plains and through this forest, all the way through, and then entered the chateau from this angle. Like a hobbit. I felt like a hobbit. I felt like, that Fellowship of the Ring. There was just me and her, though. I'd do it all again, actually. I'm a bit older now, but I'd still do it. I'd probably do it at a slower pace, But this is an amazing place, because once you get there, the spirit in the sculpture, this is one of the sculptures in Puivet. This is one of the troubadours. Look at the light in their eyes. I mean, there's something about the sculptures that are beautiful. They're almost enlightened. I don't know, when you're there, you feel it. There's something about this place. It's very special. And like I say, there's this light of the world there. It's an amazing place. That's Perpetuus again, looking back at Quéribus. I've only covered a few of the castles. There's Pays Laurens, there's Roquefixade, there's so many of them. And they all fell, one after the other. They were all taken by the Crusaders. You could talk about the Crusaders in a lecture in itself, but so yeah, I think I don't know what time. We're doing all right for time, aren't we?
Yes, we've got a few minutes.
Yeah, so we're finished. I think we're finished there because the rest of it is only relevant to, it's relevant to this. This Gospel of St. Thomas that the Cathars were interested in, I think there's some truth in this. I love this statement. I really do. The idea of Sophia actually reconnecting the land to the human spirit and the divinity of the human spirit is something that's talked about, and it's talked in the Gnostic texts as well. The return of Sophia, or it's called the correction. There's been a lot of interesting authors write about it in recent years, like John Lamlash, I think, is one of them in a book. What was the book called now? Not in His Image or something. It's called the book. There's a lot of talk about it, and I think there's something to do with the remembrance of the light in the land and the stars connecting to it. So that's my experience of the Cathars. Thank you. Thanks a lot.